There's a city in Turkey where stray cats have more legal protection than some humans get in other countries. A coffee shop where they put salt, not sugar, in your future husband's cup, just to see if he'll complain. An 18-story city built entirely underground, hiding 20,000 people from wars most of us never learned about in school. And a 1,500-year-old building where Jesus and Allah's name share the same wall, painted over but never erased. Turkey isn't what you think it is. By the end of this video, you won't see this country the same way again. Number 1. Turkish women. Free, but the gap between regions is massive. Walk through Istanbul's Karaköy district on a Tuesday afternoon and you'll see women in crop tops scrolling through Instagram next to women in full hijab waiting for the same bus. That contrast isn't an accident. It's the whole story of what it means to be a woman in Turkey today. In Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, the picture looks almost European. Women run companies, sit in parliament, perform surgery, anchor the evening news. Female labor force participation has been climbing steadily for over a decade, and university lecture halls are packed with young women outnumbering men in several fields. Fashion choices range from mini skirts to modest dress, often within the same friend group, without anyone blinking. But travel 600 miles east into rural Anatolia, and the rules shift. Extended families still hold heavy influence over who a daughter marries and when. Arranged marriages haven't disappeared. They've just gone quiet, dressed up as introductions rather than contracts. Decisions about school, work, and travel often still run through a father or older brother first. Here's where a lot of foreign coverage overcorrects. Honor killings get framed as routine, almost expected. They're not. They're criminal acts that carry severe prison sentences under Turkish law, and government data shows the numbers have dropped significantly over the past 2 decades, thanks to tougher enforcement and growing public backlash. They still happen, rarely, tragically, mostly in conservative pockets, but calling them normal misrepresents a country where most women now live lives that look nothing like that headline. The real takeaway? Turkey isn't one place for women. It's 2 timelines running side by side, one accelerating toward full modern independence, the other still negotiating with tradition, one household at a time. Number 2. The salted coffee that tests every groom. Somewhere in Turkey right now, a young man is sitting across from his future in-laws, smiling through a mouthful of coffee that tastes like seawater. And everyone in the room is watching to see if he'll complain. This is tuzlu kahve, salted coffee, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the Turkish engagement playbook. During kız isteme, the traditional asking for the bride's hand ceremony, the bride-to-be prepares Turkish coffee for her future husband's family. Everyone gets theirs made normally. The groom's cup is different. Instead of sugar, she loads it with salt, sometimes enough to make a grown man's eyes water. The logic behind it is oddly practical. Marriage, the thinking goes, isn't going to be sweet every single day. So before any rings get exchanged, the family wants proof that this man can swallow something unpleasant, keep his composure, and still show respect to the woman who made it. If he drinks the whole thing without flinching, without a single complaint, he passes. If he winces, pushes the cup away, or makes a face, that's noted too, usually with a few raised eyebrows around the room. What makes this fascinating is how it's survived. In most of the Western world, marriage customs trend toward the symbolic and ceremonial, empty gestures everyone politely performs. Salted coffee still carries a little bit of real tension in the room, even now. In Istanbul or Ankara today, families mostly play it for laughs, and the groom usually knows it's coming. But the custom hasn't disappeared, because it still does exactly what it was designed to do: turn one cup of coffee into a small, bitter rehearsal for everything marriage is about to ask of him. Number 3. The price tag on a bride. Başlık parası. In some corners of eastern Turkey, getting married still starts with a negotiation that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with money, gold, or livestock. It's called başlık parası, literally head money, and it's a custom that's survived for centuries. Before a wedding can move forward, the groom's family is expected to hand over a payment to the bride's family. Historically, that meant cash, gold coins, or animals like sheep and cattle, depending on what a family could offer and what the bride's family considered fair. Think of it less as a dowry in reverse and more as compensation. The bride's family is losing a daughter's labor and presence in the household, and başlık parası was the traditional way of settling that loss. This isn't ancient history confined to textbooks. The practice has dropped sharply nationwide and faces real pushback, especially from younger generations and women's rights groups who see it as reducing marriage to a transaction. But it hasn't vanished. Pockets of southeastern Turkey, particularly in more rural and conservative communities, still negotiate it as a standard part of getting engaged, sometimes leading to drawn-out family disputes when one side can't pay what's been asked. Here's the part worth being careful with. Başlık parası often gets linked online to bride kidnapping, as if unpaid sums are driving thousands of abductions across the country. That connection doesn't hold up. Bride kidnapping is a real, documented phenomenon in parts of Turkey, but it's a distinct issue with its own causes, and it has also declined significantly in recent years. Treating the two as one continuous crisis overstates both. What's actually happening is narrower and quieter, a fading custom, hanging on in specific regions, increasingly out of step with a country modernizing everywhere else around it. Number 4. The blue eye that's everywhere you look. Land at any airport in Turkey, and before you've even cleared customs, you'll probably spot one. A small blue and white glass eye hanging somewhere near the gate. That's nazar boncuğu, and once you know what it is, you start seeing it everywhere. The belief behind it goes back centuries. The evil eye, a kind of harm that comes not from curses or witchcraft, but from envy itself. The theory is simple and a little unsettling. If someone looks at your success, your new baby, your nice car, or your good fortune with jealousy, even unintentionally, that gaze can bring you bad luck. The Nazar amulet exists to intercept it before it reaches you. What makes this fact remarkable isn't the belief itself. Plenty of cultures have evil eye traditions. It's the sheer saturation. In Turkey, the blue eye isn't tucked away as a private charm. It's hung above front doors, dangled from rear-view mirrors, pinned to newborn babies' clothing, displayed in shop windows, stitched into office decor, and yes, even mounted near airplane cockpits. It's less a superstition on the margins and more a piece of everyday visual culture, as ordinary as a doormat. And here's the detail that makes it genuinely interesting. When a Nazar amulet cracks or shatters on its own, that's not treated as bad news. It's treated as the amulet doing its job, absorbing a wave of envy or misfortune that was heading straight for its owner, and breaking in the process so the person doesn't have to. People don't panic when one breaks. Many quietly replace it and move on, treating the crack almost like proof the protection worked. Number 5. Reading your future in the bottom of a coffee cup. Finish a cup of Turkish coffee anywhere in the country, and you're not done yet. Someone, a grandmother, a friend, maybe even an app on your phone, is probably about to ask to read your future in what's left behind. It's called kahve falı, and the process is almost ritualistic. Turkish coffee is brewed unfiltered, so thick grounds settle at the bottom of every cup. Once you've finished drinking, you flip the cup upside down onto its saucer and let it cool for several minutes. The grounds slide and settle into random shapes and streaks on the inside walls. Then someone experienced in fall, fortune-telling, turns the cup right side up and starts reading the patterns. A bird might mean good news on its way, a heart shape might point to love, scattered lines near the rim might hint at a journey ahead. What's surprising is how mainstream this stays in a country that's otherwise rapidly modernizing. This isn't some fading village tradition. Dedicated fortune-telling cafes operate in major cities. Smartphone apps let you photograph your cup for an instant reading, and AI-powered tools have started doing the same job digitally, turning a centuries-old ritual into something you can do between meetings. One thing worth being precise about, despite what some viral posts claim, there's no credible basis for the idea that certain shapes are a literal death omen. Kahve falı operates more like tarot or palm reading, a blend of intuition, tradition, and social ritual, not a scientifically or religiously codified system with fixed, ominous meanings. Most Turks treat it the way people elsewhere treat horoscopes: fun, a little eerie sometimes, rarely taken as gospel, but rarely dismissed outright either. Number 6. The spinning monks who aren't performing for you. If you catch a Sema ceremony in Konya or Istanbul, it's tempting to watch it like a show, the white robes flaring out, the slow hypnotic spin, the haunting reed flute in the background. But to the men doing it, you're not watching entertainment. You're watching prayer. These are the Mevlevi, a Sufi order founded in the devotion to Rumi, the 13th century poet and mystic whose writings on love and divine union still shape Turkish spiritual life today. The whirling itself, known as Sema, isn't choreography designed for an audience. It's a structured meditative practice meant to strip away ego and bring the practitioner, called a semazin, into a state of spiritual surrender, spinning continuously until something close to trance sets in. The white robe represents a burial shroud, the tall hat represents a tombstone, and the act of shedding the black cloak mid-ceremony symbolizes leaving the physical world behind to reach toward the divine. What gets exaggerated online is the endurance angle. Claims that these men spin for hours straight without a flicker of dizziness, as if they've transcended basic physiology. That's overstated. The ceremony follows specific musical movements with defined structure and timing, and durations vary depending on the occasion and the order performing it. Years of training do build genuinely remarkable balance and spatial control, but turning that into a superhuman claim misses the actual point of the practice entirely. Because honestly, the real story isn't how long they can spin. It's that an 800-year-old religious ritual, born from grief and devotion after Rumi's death, still happens today in the same spirit it started in, even as tourists fill the seats around it with cameras out, half watching something far older and more serious than they probably realize. Number 7. The founding father you cannot insult. By law. In most countries, ripping a banknote in half is the kind of thing that gets you a weird look, maybe a lecture from your grandmother. In Turkey, if that banknote has Atatürk's face on it and you do something that crosses into genuine insult territory, you could be looking at an actual criminal case. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk founded modern Turkey out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, and over a century later, his image is still protected by something most countries don't have: a dedicated criminal law built around one man's memory. It's called Law Number 5816, passed in 1951, and it makes publicly insulting Atatürk's memory or destroying objects representing him a prosecutable offense, carrying real prison time in serious cases. His portrait hangs in government offices, schools, and most businesses. His silhouette appears on currency, statues stand in nearly every town square, and Atatürk isn't just a surname, it's closer to a national title. But this is where a lot of foreign content gets sloppy, and it's worth slowing down here. The claim that simply tearing or crumpling a banknote will get you arrested on the spot is an exaggeration. That's not how the law functions in practice. Same with the idea that secret police are watching for casual remarks and swooping in immediately. Enforcement is real, and prosecutions do happen, but they typically involve deliberate, public, unambiguous acts of disrespect, not an accidental crease in a 5 lira bill. What this law really reveals isn't paranoia. It's how deeply Atatürk's legacy is woven into Turkish national identity, decades after his death. Criticizing certain policies in Turkey is one thing. Attacking the man himself is treated, legally and culturally, as something closer to attacking the country's foundation. Number 8. The friendly stranger who wants to buy you a drink. It usually starts the same way. You're walking around Taksim Square or wandering through Beyoğlu at night, and someone friendly strikes up a conversation. Maybe he's from a different city. Maybe he just wants to practice English. Maybe he knows a great little bar nearby. He seems genuinely nice. That's the whole point. This is one of Istanbul's most well-documented tourist scams, and it's persisted for years specifically because it doesn't feel like a scam while it's happening. The stranger leads you to a bar that looks completely normal, sometimes upscale, sometimes a cozy little spot, and the drinks start flowing, often on what feels like a generous, casual night out. Then the bill arrives. And it's not $50. It's sometimes hundreds, occasionally even more, for a handful of beers or cocktails that should have cost a fraction of that. This isn't an urban myth traded between backpackers. Multiple foreign embassies and consulates, including the U.S. State Department, have issued formal travel advisories specifically warning visitors about this exact setup in Istanbul's nightlife districts. It's organized enough that staff at these venues are often in on it, and the friendly local is frequently working on commission for steering people in. What shouldn't get exaggerated is what happens if you refuse to pay. Online horror stories love to claim mafia enforcers appear and beat people who won't cooperate. That's sensationalized and not the documented norm. The real pressure is usually more mundane: aggressive staff, intimidation, sometimes a manager hovering uncomfortably close until you pay just to leave. Unpleasant and occasionally tense, yes. A guaranteed violent mafia encounter, no. The actual lesson embassies push hardest isn't about danger, it's about declining the invitation in the first place. Number 9. Why a basic car in Turkey can cost more than a house down payment. Imagine pricing out a mid-range sedan and discovering the tax alone costs more than the car itself. That's not a hypothetical in Turkey, it's just Tuesday at the dealership. The culprit is a tax called OTV, the Special Consumption Tax, and it's brutal by global standards. It's applied on top of the vehicle's base price, scaled depending on engine size and value, and then Turkey adds its standard VAT on top of that combined number. The math compounds fast. For certain mid-size and larger engine vehicles, the total tax burden can exceed 200% of the car's original price, meaning a vehicle that would cost $20,000 elsewhere can end up priced well north of $60,000 once Turkish taxes finish stacking on top of each other. This isn't a minor inconvenience baked into the system, it's reshaped the entire car market. Turkey routinely ranks among the most expensive countries in Europe to buy a vehicle, often surpassing wealthier Western European nations despite having a considerably lower average income. Small, low-engine cars get taxed comparatively lighter, which is exactly why Turkish roads are dominated by compact, economical models rather than the SUVs and larger sedans common elsewhere. The reasoning behind such an aggressive tax isn't random either. It functions partly as a luxury deterrent and partly as a major revenue stream for the government, given how reliably people still buy cars despite the markup. But the practical result for ordinary Turks is stark. Car ownership, something taken for granted as a basic milestone in much of the world, becomes a genuine financial stretch, one that can take years of saving, financing, or compromise to actually reach. Number 10. The country that gave English an idiom about smoking. There's an old English phrase, "smoke like a Turk," used for centuries to describe someone who smokes constantly, heavily, without apology. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from a reputation Turkey built over generations, and one that, to a real extent, still holds today. According to World Health Organization data, somewhere around 28 to 32% of Turkish adults smoke, a rate that puts Turkey among the higher smoking nations in Europe, well above many of its Western neighbors. The split between genders is significant too. Smoking rates among Turkish men run considerably higher than among women, reflecting both cultural patterns and decades of social norms around who smokes openly and who doesn't. Walk through any Turkish city and the evidence is hard to miss. Outdoor cafe seating exists practically as much for cigarettes as for tea and coffee. Smoking sections spill out onto sidewalks outside restaurants and bars. Tobacco has historically been woven into Turkish cafe culture so thoroughly that quitting becomes a genuinely uphill social battle. When smoking is part of how people socialize, linger, and pass time together, cutting it out means cutting against the grain of daily life itself. The government hasn't ignored this. Turkey has rolled out increasingly aggressive anti-smoking laws over the past 2 decades. Indoor smoking bans, graphic warning labels, advertising restrictions, steep tobacco taxes, and the efforts have had a real, measurable effect, with smoking rates gradually declining from where they once stood. But gradually is the key word. Turkey isn't anywhere close to smoke-free, and that old idiom, born centuries ago, still isn't entirely outdated. It's softened, not retired. Number 11. The tiny tulip glass that never seems to empty. Sit down anywhere in Turkey, a carpet shop, a barber chair, a business meeting, a neighbor's living room, and within minutes, someone is going to ask if you want chai. Saying yes isn't really optional in any social sense. It's just what happens. Turkey consistently ranks among the highest per capita tea consumers on the planet, regularly outpacing countries far more internationally associated with tea culture, like the UK or China. It's brewed strong, dark, and double-steeped in a stacked kettle system called a saydanlık, then served in small, curved glasses shaped unmistakably like tulips, thin-waisted, flared at the top, designed specifically to keep the outside cool to the touch, while the tea inside stays scalding hot. That tulip glass has become as visually tied to Turkey as the evil eye amulet or a domed mosque skyline. What makes tea different here isn't just the volume consumed, it's the function it serves socially. Offering chai is essentially how hospitality gets expressed without words. Walk into a shop just to browse, and the owner will often offer tea before even discussing prices. Sit down for a business negotiation, and tea arrives before contracts do. It's less a beverage choice and more a social reflex, a small ritual that says, "You're welcome here," before anyone says anything at all. Where things get overstated is the idea that refusing that first glass is some grave social insult, as if turning down tea is read as rejecting friendship itself. That's exaggerated. Turks are generally relaxed about it. Saying no thank you doesn't trigger offense or awkward tension in most everyday situations. The deeper truth is simpler and a little warmer. Tea isn't a test in Turkey. It's just the country's way of saying hello. Number 12. The city where stray cats run the show. Istanbul has a nickname that has nothing to do with its mosques, its bridges, or its history. Locals and visitors alike just call it the City of Cats. And once you've walked its streets, you understand exactly why. Stray cats aren't an unfortunate side effect of urban life here. They're practically civic infrastructure. They nap on cafe chairs, wander into shops, curl up on ancient ruins, and get fed by shopkeepers who've appointed themselves unofficial caretakers without anyone asking them to. Turkey backs this up with real legal protections too. Animal welfare laws exist specifically to shield strays from harm, and harming or killing them is a punishable offense, not just a social taboo. The most genuinely clever part of this culture is something tangible you can actually see in public parks. Reverse vending machines that accept empty plastic bottles and dispense cat or dog food in return. It's an elegant solution to two problems at once: plastic waste and stray hunger, funded through recycling rather than charity, and it's been quietly expanding across several Turkish cities as a model other places have taken notice of. One claim that needs to be retired, though: the idea that killing a cat obligates someone to build a mosque as religious penance. That's folklore, not law, a story passed down for generations, sometimes loosely tied to Islamic teachings about kindness toward animals, but it has never existed as actual legal or religious doctrine. What's real is simpler and arguably more telling. A culture that has, over generations, decided these animals belong to the city collectively, cared for by thousands of small individual acts rather than any single rule enforcing it. Number 13. The 18-story city buried beneath Cappadocia. While most ancient civilizations built upward, towers, temples, walls reaching toward the sky, one community in central Turkey did the opposite. They built down. Way down. Beneath the surreal rock landscape of Cappadocia sits Karaköy, an underground city carved roughly 18 stories into soft volcanic stone, descending to depths of around 85 meters. At its peak capacity, it could shelter approximately 20,000 people, not for a night, but for extended periods, sometimes weeks at a time, whenever conflict or invasion threatened the surface above. What makes Karaköy remarkable isn't just its depth, it's how completely self-sufficient it was engineered to be. This wasn't a hole to hide in. It functioned as an entire subterranean settlement, complete with deep water wells carved straight down to underground aquifers, full churches for religious services, massive storage rooms for grain and supplies, and even stables where livestock could be kept safely below ground alongside the people who depended on them. Ventilation shafts threaded through the entire structure, channeling fresh air down to levels where natural light never reached. The engineering logic gets even more impressive the closer you look. Heavy circular stone doors could be rolled across narrow corridors from the inside, sealing off sections of the city against intruders, while narrow, low passageways forced anyone moving through them to travel single file and hunched over. Useless for organized defense if you were unfamiliar with the layout, but second nature if you'd lived there your whole life. It's a level of civil engineering most people associate with modern military bunkers, except this one was carved by hand into volcanic rock, centuries before anyone had a word for bunker at all. Number 14. The upside-down Medusa nobody can explain. Walk down into the dim, cathedral-like cavern of Istanbul's Basilica Cistern, past hundreds of marble columns rising out of shallow water, and you'll eventually reach two stone faces that have puzzled visitors for centuries. They're carved heads of Medusa, repurposed from some earlier structure as bases for two of the cistern's columns. And nobody, not historians, not archaeologists, not anyone, actually knows why they're positioned the way they are. One head sits sideways, tilted on its cheek. The other is fully inverted, upside down, staring at the floor instead of out at visitors. In Greek mythology, Medusa's gaze famously turned people to stone, and ancient builders sometimes used her image deliberately, believing it carried protective power against evil. That part of the story is well documented. What isn't documented is the reasoning behind the orientation. Over the centuries, people have proposed plenty of explanations that turning her sideways or upside down neutralized her petrifying stare so workers could safely use the stone without fear, that the placement was purely practical, sized to fit the columns regardless of orientation, or that it carried some symbolic meaning now lost to history. None of these theories have solid evidence behind them. They're educated guesses, repeated often enough online, that some get presented as settled fact when they're really just speculation dressed up with confidence. It's a rare moment in Istanbul's history where the honest answer is simply, we don't know. And there's something fitting about that uncertainty, sitting quietly underground, mostly ignored for 15 centuries until rediscovery in the 1980s, in a city otherwise obsessed with explaining and documenting every layer of its own past. Number 15. The building where two religions share the same walls. Stand in the center of Hagia Sophia and look up, and you'll catch something almost nowhere else on earth offers. Golden Christian mosaics and sweeping Islamic calligraphy occupying the exact same space, neither one fully erased to make room for the other. The reason comes down to one decision made centuries ago that turned out to be quietly merciful. When the Ottomans converted Hagia Sophia from a Byzantine cathedral into a mosque after the 1453 conquest of Constantinople, the original Christian mosaics, saints, angels, depictions of Mary and Christ, weren't smashed or chiseled away. Instead, they were covered over with plaster and whitewash, a far less destructive choice than the outright demolition seen in many other conquered religious sites throughout history. Whether driven by respect, practicality, or simple convenience hardly matters now, because that plaster ended up protecting what was underneath for nearly 500 years. When restoration work began in the 20th century, workers carefully removed sections of that covering and uncovered something extraordinary, still largely intact beneath it. Today, visitors can stand in one sightline and see a Byzantine mosaic of the Virgin Mary holding Christ on one section of wall, while elaborate Arabic calligraphy spelling out the names of Allah, Muhammad, and the early caliphs curves across massive medallions nearby. Two religious traditions, separated by nearly 1,000 years of history, sharing wall space rather than competing for it. It's a rare architectural arrangement, and it makes Hagia Sophia function as something closer to a layered historical document than a single-purpose building. Byzantine Empire, Ottoman conquest, secular museum era, and active mosque again today, all visible at once if you know where to look. Few buildings anywhere let you witness that much religious and political history without it being explained to you first. Here, you can just see it.